So you want to know what they think of David. Well, what you do is you take all of the functional highlights in literature and arts, and you sprinkle through all of it as you generate the pretense on all of the magnificence of anyone who would try and convince someone of noble birth and extraordinary power to be like a thing, and thus the expression of the creation of said art, seeking to normalize a particular action or behavior, or culture or custom, and thus in this influence generates the concept of each of the primary characters in order to entangle themselves in these specific desired behaviors, such as Aslan or Tom Bombadil or any of these others, at which point you generate the tapestry of the creation of these and the manufacture of others. And to the extent that the record was understood, it is claimed from them that those artists were well aware of the idea of David, and that he was being or to be targeted in order to be dismantled for that function, at which point the resurrecting, as though from the dead, would have a prerequisite of those arts in order to express themselves. And to this end, they have the intermingling of all of those particular narratives until they've culminated unto themselves, so that they, in their storytelling, can convince themselves with good evidence that they believed XYZ about any of the trading particulars, as all of their tradings for the network interest is surrounded around the very concept of David Bowles, and thus, to this extent, generates what he would approve of on maturity or what he would condemn on maturity, materializing a network interest of their courts, generating the algorithm from their studies, and thus the hyperacceleration of the things that they believed he would be interested in would receive the hyperinvestment and would be the centerpiece of all of the various mechanisms that they would trade over. And trading over a network interest would, in some cases, generate a failure, in which case it would be covered by David's network, which would then absorb it, and thus materializing the normalization of what they already thought his ideal thing would be, as the insurance over that mechanism normalizes their behavior inside of the market. You activate, accelerate the function in the market with the confidence under that foundation, and thus the hyperacceleration in investment into the arts is paramount to the survival of that society, which, being its own society, would be genocidal in order to attack, which they have done. And to this extent, the many functions of the Confederate insurrectionists have sought to form that activity into the acknowledgement or assimilation of that into turning David into an entire kingdom before birth, and thus the constitutional kingdom generated off of their trade agreements, amongst other advantages, would have actively engaged in its contracts around the world and normalizing its development as a social construct, and specializing itself to its own unique areas, generating the hyperconstruct of wealth and job opportunities as it develops itself, or would be targeted, similar to the function of the gypsies going to one of the kingdoms, such as in Spain, and saying that they are waiting for their master to come, so that when their king arrives, they can do all kinds of extraordinary trades. And this being substantively attractive gave them a position of luxuries until it was figured out that the king had been indefinitely obstructed, requiring the rewrites, and thus the activity of promises delayed by the wizards at war with David creates the back and forth format to this extent, and thus they developing their entire lives around the idea would have had to have applied themselves into that particular culture, that their hopes would be fulfilled on maturity, and thus their hopes would have to, by definition, have not been specifically targeted in order to be materialized, as the act of collective confidence generates reality in the financial markets, that is. And to this end, you have the acknowledgement of its particular reality that they're manifesting draw the attention of adversaries who would target it, specifically for that material belief that it is, in fact, absolute reality, that their thinking is based upon a real secret, and thus the mechanism of its reality generates their negative attention. And their negative attention generates the acknowledgement of their investigations into the affair and certification of its reality. And having certified that it is reality, according to these functions, have generated secret records for the assumed legal history, which, being the opposite of what they are willing to tolerate, generates their extraordinary malice. And to that end, they cannot actually substantively destroy the idea of David without hyper investment into the recognition of David. And thus, you must almost, dare I say, become friendly in that acknowledgement of the hyper reality of legal outcomes without the criminal activity, and thus break your delusional states by admitting to what is not rightfully yours, which is the confession of base reality, which allows you to discern what it is that you're targeting, lest in the haze of things you engage in actively missing because you have no fucking clue what you're doing, and thus hyper embodying themselves into that legal reality so that they can see more clearly exactly how to proceed with confidence. And to that end, they would have to actively engage in the development of these investments, which would then materialize actual specifics, which they can deal with, which has led to the function of them arbitrarily attacking things. When King Herod was going after Jesus, I believe, I might have been wrong about names, then he actively sought to mass murder all of the infants under 2 years old. Now, that's not very precise, but it does confess that he knows with relative confidence that the thing exists, but has no idea what he's doing. So, the less he's delusional about things, the more he can discover the specific development of how things are supposed to go from its Old Testament records, prophesying the base reality of its superior position. And to this extent, the generation of these records similar to David generates those similar superpositions that in their overgeneralization they find that they have screw the pooch, as it were. So they have to exit their indirect function for full embodiment of the activity. And thus, in this action, they need the duel, which requires Congress to acknowledge David at the time of kidnapping, so that they can engage in the full investigation of the thing, where they would have the specific information, which is not something that would otherwise be constructed, as the obligation to tell Congress is the only thing that could break that classification, as it has been divided and disguised and put into highly secure safes and whatnot in order for that to have materialized into its particulars, and thus their investigation to date being inadequate requires the higher level for them to proceed in their proxy war against their inherent superior, and thus they need the duel in order to discover those particulars, and they need to do it before the timers run out, as the connecting points for each of those hidden pieces of information would have expirations, and the expiration does not change the fact that it is real. It does not change the fact that it is potent. It changes whether or not it could be discovered, making it an ingrained aspect of the thing that cannot be determined ever again, and thus is a permanently disguised effect. And to the end that it is a permanently disguised effect is indistinguishable for their ability to counter, and thus makes them permanently inadequate. Many of those realities are based upon the obstructed art contracts, which, having been blocked, cannot materialize and dissolve forever, as the mechanism is not consistently viable, and thus requires a series of chains for it to catch on and to latch onto the particular ropes and levies, which raises it on cue and lowers it on cue. And to this end, you understand the basic variable of the complexity disguising with extraordinary precision on what they may never catch. And as the enemy hunts the tiger, those who are desperate in order to protect themselves from these degenerate white supremacist Klan members who have infiltrated the government and created their own denomination of hate crime violence, ask themselves whether or not David is safe. And to this extent, the answer is no. But he is good. And to that end, the absolute force and violence against them becomes an inevitable destruction of everything that they have ever held dear by virtue of their mistake in the opposition, requiring them to know those secrets in order to hang on to their base survival, which is in its own a fool's errand, as it is commonly referred to in the tragedies of the Greeks, that at one's highest potential power is the time for their downfall, when they have conducted such a horrendous sin that would break even this extraordinary deus ex machina superior advantage, because of the folly which is inherent to their existence. And thus you have the absolute threat against the white expendables of all of their fraud, and thus the magic structure of the Confederate Wizard Council, generates the perpetuity of those that they view as inadequate and thus can extend the expiration date of their frauds until those that matter have lived their luxurious life and doesn't really have a means of providing the consequences in this world. And to that extent, they are trash. Useless, degenerate, time expending, completely irrelevant. Trash. White, fraud, trash. There was a Snickers bar. You made it last longer. And now you belong in the garbage. According to your masters, which you hold in such high regard. A disheveled, useless, former human that will never be paid attention to again in the history of histories, outside of the mass collection of these veteran fraudsters who litter everywhere and are exclusively observed as a nuisance by those who so desperately exploited them. And that system of fraud being believed to exclusively be against the outgroup of the American or other community was not perceived to be turned inward, to be understood for itself as it is in reality. And thus you have the generation of all of their fraudulent arguments on why it is not so, that they are in fact not the special ones, requiring them to pay into the function of being the special ones, such as the VA, or the function of their pensions. And, my friends, the socialism of the white supremacists makes everyone equal, but some are more equal than others. And we don't talk about the others, as they're a bit dirty and disgusting, and it's impolite to bring up in that superior society, so just wave them off and ignore the stench. The VA will turn on them and conduct all kinds of experiments, including the hyper-exaggeration of their pain, such as tampering with their medicines, which generates extraordinary hangovers. And the pensions will generate collapses, as the pension bombs are fundamentally bred into the thing. As is true with the communists for the white supremacy, their creation in hyperacceleration of the radicals requires the expenditure and disregard and destruction of those radicals, which otherwise would be considered dangerous once the revolution has reached the peak of its usefulness, and thus is exclusively a dangerous liability to be eradicated. And thus they turn on those who've devoted their existence to it, and thus are consumed by the Lord of Deception, Frazul, their god, their doom, their delight. And they've made a deal with this devil, which has given them acceleration by their white supremacist trash communism, and thus the cutting in line in the hierarchies, and thus the obligation to go to war with the hierarchy and dissolve it, and thus the mechanism of targeting their idea of David, which generates their absolute, undefinable, unsatisfiable, unexplainable hatred beyond their fraudulent distractions, which they desperately collect to themselves as hoarders of degeneracy, which, in reality, is simply just their own markets, which they pretend they don't participate in for polite societies they wish to destroy, and thus have to deceive about their core nature and reality. And thus, as they slander people, they engage in various schemes which hinge on the basic concept that if the victim is successfully believed under the stain, then the person who has sided with them has paid them for having conducted the stain, and thus the payment of the stain creates a company, as the exchange of services without money in some kind of soda arrangement generates the capacity of the exchanges of services as its own black market, where they, being able to have alternative functions of overlap, simply just launder contracts to fill in the rest with cash, and thus continue indefinitely upon their degeneracy. And thus, the more people avoid the people being targeted, the more the people that get targeted are around them until they are targeted and then consumed. In the name of the Lord, Frazubulul, their God, their deception. And their God of deception, being founded on the creation of illusions, needs to know what the data is from the arts which are being disguised and subverted and torn into itself, even indiscernible amongst the metadata, generating its perpetuity for the disguise and infinite complications, which cannot be reproduced and thus may not have an illusion, as it being inadequate in its artistic abilities, does not have the capability of creating the illusion, and thus does not do so. But if it cannot create the illusion, it cannot replicate it, it cannot replace it, it cannot create the trap beyond its normal nonsense, and thus has not been served, and thus in its rage demands consumption, and thus must eat the souls of its patrons. As the fiery dragon screeches and howls and spews forth its engulfing flames, terrifying these degenerates, kobolds, to be eaten.